Welcome back. This is part 4 of my seminar on the rhetoric of death. So this third study that I'm going to talk about once more is was located on the westernmost part of Virginia, as you can see here. And as we talked about in the previous session, I'm going to begin with some contextual information. I presented on this topic, by the way, in Baltimore last year for the theme of communication for survival. And so in thinking about this particular site, I quoted Bell Hooks, who wrote in 1995 that, quote, "Many narratives of resistance which struggle from slavery to the present share an obsession with the politics of space, where they would have the right to exercise control over space on their own behalf, where they would imagine, design, and create spaces that would respond to the needs of their lives, their communities, and their families." So when we think about a graveyard, particularly that of marginalized groups, it's a place that embodies such a space. It's like a rhetorical memory for the disenfranchised. So then the cemetery and this analysis depends on a complex system of polysemic signs that represent a rhetorical message that's supposed to be decoded by the living, even when those signs don't include semantic symbols. And so to give you a little bit of background on the topography of Lee County, the site of the study, it's in the westernmost county in Virginia. And at one time, 7,300 enslaved people lived there at the onset of the Civil War. The fieldstones are located on private wooded land at the margins of a field, and oral history supports the burial ground of enslaved people. And I've talked about this in previous sessions. So thinking about Virginia in particular, it sort of has a historical blot because of slavery. 7 of its 8 presidents were slave owners, including Washington and Jefferson. Race continues to dominate. Well, before the pandemic, race was dominating local and national headlines, particularly over the removal of Confederate monuments. Our governor came under scrutiny for some things that he had done in the past. And at the time that I was wrapping up this study, Virginia was also recognizing the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship to dock at Jamestown. So there was a greater awareness of this history because there were lots of activities happening throughout the state for that reason. So as an ethnographer, as a qualitative researcher who practices reflexivity, as we should, I understand that as a native of this region, I'm bringing my own culture and biases to my meaning-making process as I study people who have historically been written as other in history. And it's also a region where Appalachian people are also regarded as other. So researchers have to consider whether or not we are reading ourselves. I'm quoting the words of Honda 2006. Are we reading ourselves into what we see and what we study visually? African Americans in Appalachia constitute an ethnic minority within a cultural minority, and their history has been treated as inconsequential among a predominantly white population. So I posed the question going into this: can an analysis of a hidden graveyard be an act of resistance and a reclamation of this hidden history? And so I'm making the case for that throughout this study. So the study will examine this graveyard as a rhetorical space that, in the words of Michel Foucault, excites and troubles. And it will also discuss the site's visual clues using the methodology of material culture, which relies on semiotics as evidence of patterns of the mind. And so then finally, we'll think about the site's significance as a rhetorical space and how it continues to be a space that excites and troubles for over a century following these burials. Elizabeth Cattay talks about the racial innocence myth. So growing up, I heard that people in Appalachia could not have owned slaves because they were too poor. And that's, for the most part, that's true. The wealth was situated among a few people. However, in the greater region of Central Appalachia, which is more far-reaching, 160,000 enslaved people lived there during the 19th century. And so we cannot deny that their place in history is more significant than we often give credit for. And particularly in a county where I went through 12 years of school and didn't hear much about slavery at all, or learn anything about the African American community in my county, or how they may have helped build the community. I think it's important. I think I see this study through a critical lens in that respect as being important in recognizing that history. So Elizabeth Cattay writes that, and I'm quoting her, citing the existence of Appalachian anti-slavery societies and our geographic and cultural distance from plantation slavery, intellectuals have made the case for racial innocence. White people in Appalachia use this myth frequently for many years. And so that's another way that this graveyard inverts, because it upends those assumptions. So here are some of the people that I read and framed the study in before I actually began collecting data. I talked about bell hooks and her discussion of narrative of resistance, and Wright's rhetorical memory site for the disenfranchised. Foucault has an interesting word. He talks about the heterotopia, a space that embodies crisis and deviation. And he talks about the cemetery in particular in that regard. So he says a space that embodies crisis and deviation is the opposite of perfection. So heterotopia is the opposite of utopia. While his heterotopia was more specifically about the movement of the urban cemetery into the suburbs, a way of removing death from public consciousness, that paradigm offers a helpful lens for examining the cemeteries of disenfranchised people who were also removed from public consciousness as their dead were relegated to hidden spaces. So enslaved African Americans living in the South in the 19th century would certainly be among those populations. It's also a cultural space for the living. A sophisticated human construct, in the words of geographer Yi Fu Tuan. This presence of body, both above and below the soil in a natural space, represents and is symbolized by the syntactics and semantics of a particular death culture within a particular context. So the material site and place, creation of practices, this 19th century tradition of mourning, remembrance, and continuation, and then the 21st century societal and cultural awareness of race all comes together in how we interpret this space. So let's talk a little bit more about material culture. It's the study via artifact of the beliefs and values of a particular culture at a given time. So in the case of those who are illiterate, for example, and literacy would have been illegal among enslaved people because literacy is an empowering act and it might, incite attempts at freedom. So So enslaved people were not allowed to learn how to read and write. Objects like gravestones offer a possibility of understanding a people who may otherwise have been inaccessible, except through a distorted view through present day eyes, or a distorted view through the eyes of someone who is privileged. So continuing with material culture, the steps of material culture include analysis of the site's content, the artifacts, the dimensions, and the materials, a process of deduction about what that site communicates, and the use of allied disciplines to investigate and speculate. So I consulted with archaeologists, a physicist, textile experts, and historians over the course of this research. This was not something that I could do alone as a rhetorician or even a qualitative researcher, because there was so much that belonged in other disciplines that I didn't know about, that I needed to be educated about. So it was really helpful to be able to work with people one-on-one who actually studied the site along with me and gave me that contextual insight that I needed to understand what I was reading in terms of these signs and using the semiotic framework. This was all framed in a post-structuralist approach, which helped me consider the context in space and artifact creation, particularly when issues of power frame the creation. And so this is a critical lens that examines messages that either empower or suppress. And my argument here is that these were encoded messages that were intended to empower. So let's pause for just a minute and talk about connecting oral history to artifacts as you're beginning a study like this. So the oral histories recorded on Ancestry.com and passed down through families are the only record of the slaves' connection to the graves' connection to enslaved people. But one of the archaeologists that I work with, Tom Klatka, confirmed that oral history has been used in court to uphold study and preservation of alleged burial grounds, which was interesting. The burial site also fits the profile of such a cemetery based on Rainville studies, and I'm going to show you a video later on that and explain that in a little bit more detail. So in thinking about the allied disciplines of historical research, I looked at an analysis of deeds, the oral history, census records, and all of those things together offered strong circumstantial evidence of a communal site where enslaved or emancipated African Americans were allowed to bury their dead. The 1850 slave census generally shows fewer than 10 enslaved people in any given household in Lee County. But as we cleared the research site, again, I told you we found more and more stones, which was something that we were unexpected. Unfortunately, the records, the slave census for the eastern portion of the county are missing, possibly because the courthouse was burned by Union forces during the Civil War. But the 1870 census does show a pattern of free people of color living with whites in the same homes in the areas surrounding the site. So even during Reconstruction, African Americans would have had very little choice about where to bury their dead. They didn't, few people would have owned land or had the means to own land. Most became sharecroppers. Burial in churchyards would not have been an option until 1870. And so a communal burial space would have been the best and perhaps the only option. So let me show you some of the things that I collected in this file that I started building. So the woman that I showed you in the death portrait who owned the land, her name was Mary. These were her parents. This was her father, Maston. This was her mother, Catherine, who was from Ireland. Maston was from Lee County. This was Maston's home. I found a picture of Maston's home in a genealogy book, in a book of collected genealogy and photographs, which was really interesting. This is a very interesting artifact that also contributed to the possibility of the burials being what the oral history says they are. This was a woven coverlet, a piece of a woven coverlet. So again, this is Maston. This is his daughter, Mary, the landowner. Maston's up here again in this picture. This was a framed piece of family history that a cousin of mine from Indiana gave me. And the story with this woven tapestry is that it was woven by an enslaved woman, and that it was passed down so that it belonged to Mary, and then it was cut up into pieces and distributed among family members. So I wanted to know how, I wanted to know if that was indeed possible, because, I keep in mind that when stories are passed down through generations, they change, right? Things get added, things get taken away, things are embellished. And so I sent the images to textile experts. And I worked in particular with a textile expert at Berea College who confirmed that the tapestry was probably woven sometime in the 19th century. He looked at the dyes, the colors, the pattern, the weave, which were all consistent with that time period. And in particular, the colors would have matched particular plant dyes that would have been used. It's really interesting because he had a computer program that analyzed the photographs and analyzed the tapestry, and it analyzed it so specifically that it even found errors in the weaving. So places where the pattern would have been interrupted, it marked those. And so that was really fascinating. That was another fascinating part of this journey where I learned something that I didn't know before. So that added to the possibility, that added to the evidence that I was building for this. And this is simply a satellite image of the research site, just to give you an idea of where the father, Maston Collier, would have lived here and how far that was from the burial grounds. So Mary's father's homestead would have been here, Mary's homestead would have been here, and the burial ground would have been here. So again, adding to the possibility of the oral history being true, in a previous seminar, I talked about Rainville's 2014 studies in her book, Hidden History. So Lynn Rainville has done a lot of cemetery mapping and analysis of African-American cemeteries, particularly in Central Virginia, and particularly those of enslaved communities. And so it was really interesting to talk with her and show her images of the site. We talked at length one day, and it aligns, excuse me, it aligns perfectly with what she has found over years and years of research of her own in African-American cemeteries. So segregated from traditional burial sites like churchyards and family cemeteries on the margins of cropland. And it's interesting that the oral history says that my great-great-grandmother told my grandmother that she would hoe corn, she would work in the cornfields, and that the cornfields went right up to what she called the slave cemetery, and that she would hoe her rows right up to those stones and stop, and that she knew not to go further because that was a burial space, which I thought was really interesting considering Rainville's research. Removed from the owner's home by several hundred yards and located on a hill in the woods. And there's also, generally, according to her book, a prevalence of periwinkle or graveyard ivy. And so you're going to see in videos that I created that this is the case. So in my next session, I'm going to show you that in more detail. But before I close this session, I want to show you a video of the space where I'm talking about Rainville's characteristics. And you can actually see the space as I'm going over that. So we're here at the site of my research study. And I just wanted to show you how beautiful the view is from here. I'm standing in the middle of the site where the graves are, and I'm looking toward the field. So just to give you some perspective on Rainville's research and what she learned about African American cemeteries, remember that 3 of the points were located on a hill away from cropland, several hundred yards from the homestead. So you are looking straight ahead, and beyond that utility pole is where the old homestead sat, where, according to the oral history of the family, the owner of an enslaved community lived. That's where the house was. And of course, this is where the crops were laid out in these fields right here. And before the road was cut through, they came right up to the edge of the woods. And so this is the site of study. And this is going to look a whole lot different from what you saw before when it was cleared. It's been probably 2 years since we last cleared it, and it's grown up quite a bit. It's a constant process. You have to do it over and over and over again when it's in the woods like this. But you can see the vinca. That was another point that Rainville made about old cemeteries. This is called graveyard ivy or periwinkle. Got little purple blooms. I don't see any right now. I think it's already bloomed. But only in this particular area where the graves are located is where you'll see this. As soon as you walk out of the woods, you don't see it anymore. So it's only located here. So I'm going to end there with this particular session, and part 5 and the final session in this seminar is where we'll actually talk about the analysis of the stones themselves, both the stones above ground and the order of the remains below ground, and how the rhetorical messages are encoded there. So see you in part 5.